Note: when I say Russian women, I mean women from the former Soviet republics, which include Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, and a few others. All these countries share a common recent history. All were part of the Soviet Union, and as a result, they now have comparable quality of life, face similar political and economic challenges, have similar social dynamics, which, among other things, include views and expectations towards women. I will use the terms FSU, former Soviet Union, and Russian interchangeably. And whenever I say Russian, by that I will also mean from any other post-Soviet territory. So, let's get to this touchy subject. Are Russian and other FSU, former Soviet Union, women really more likely than Western women to be materialistic and money-oriented? Do they tend to be more willing to trade their looks and sexuality for status and material possessions? I believe it is important to address this subject because, let's face it, if not all, then many Western citizens, when they hear about Russian or other Eastern European women, somewhere among perhaps other associations, have this mail-order bride idea that inevitably comes up. And that's okay. If it does come up, then there must be a reason for it. Also, being myself a Russian woman, I believe I have the right to talk about this subject in a straightforward, open way, and I have the right to say what I have found and observed without worrying too much about being too direct or even too honest. To ensure accuracy, I try my best to only include things that I've both myself observed in some way and that I've also seen pointed out by others. Okay, now that you know that I'm extra honest and extra diligent, let's get started. First, the obvious truth. No, not all Russian women are gold diggers or see men primarily in terms of their money-making ability. In fact, I would honestly say that Russian women tend to fall towards both ends of the spectrum, as opposed to being closer to the middle, meaning more of them are likely to be materialistic, quote-unquote gold diggers, but also more of them tend to be too self-sacrificing, like being the only stable income provider in the family, or even often staying with straight-up abusive and unsuccessful unemployed man and not leaving. This is at least partly because being single or divorced is still viewed as a significant failure for a woman, but not so much for a man in this society. Many women in Russia earn more than their husbands and, on top of that, continue to do most of the housework because it just isn't a man's job to clean and cook and watch after small children. Also, being a stay-at-home housewife is much less common in Russia than it is in North America. Partly, this is because the income in Russia is too low to allow for only one person to work and still be able to support the family. But the other reason is the Soviet history of Russia, where being a non-working, able-bodied adult was unacceptable and even punishable by law. We will bring this up more in our next video on how traditional or not traditional Russian women really are. That being said, at the same time, at the other end of the spectrum, more Russian women are willing to be sexually objectified, to monetize their body and sexuality in different ways, including dating and marrying a man they feel no connection with or attraction towards, in exchange for financial stability, or a foreign passport. In this part of the video, I want to answer the question about exactly why that is. The fact that Russia is a less prosperous country than most Western countries does not alone account for this. In order to explain this, we have to look at what kind of an environment these women, who are now in their 20s and 30s and even 40s, grew up in, which means to look at what Russia and other former Soviet countries were like in the 90s and early 2000s. Also, I want to mention that by this year, 2021, many of these tendencies have become a lot less noticeable, but you can certainly still see that the pattern is still there. So, as many of you know, before 1991, there was no independent country such as Russia or Ukraine or Belarus, or many others. Only one big USSR. The Soviet Union was a very idealistic society. There was a collectivist culture of serving your country and your people, of working towards the greater common goal, of building the communist future, as opposed to values related to individualism, which were, and still are, celebrated in the West. Also, very importantly, despite the fact that the Soviet Union was definitely not a religious country. In fact, religion was strongly discouraged and even at times persecuted there. When it came to upholding high moral standards in its citizens, the USSR, with its communist ideals and standards, which you were expected to fulfill to be considered a worthy citizen, was just as effective, if not more effective, than any religious institution. These moral principles were monitored and ensured in a centralized way. For example, there was censorship in the media, so no kind of sexually suggestive content was ever allowed on TV or in other forms of the media, like books and magazines, or even in the arts. Prostitution, or things like homosexuality, or even just sexuality, were virtually unheard of. The first two were also offenses punishable by law, and all three were unheard of because people had nowhere to get these wrong or corrupt ideas from, since all media were controlled and censored by the government. In fact, there's even a popular expression, there is no sex in the USSR. Even divorce was handled as a public concern rather than a private affair, because a breakdown of a family was seen as weakening the foundation of the Soviet society. As the expression goes, a family is a cell of the society. So the officials would get involved to try and dissuade the couple from divorcing, although divorce was legal and possible if both parties were determined enough. So all in all, the absolute majority of the Soviet citizens were rather innocent and naive when it came to sex and sexuality, at least compared to their Western counterparts, who experienced their sexual revolution as early as the 60s. This is important because in the 90s, when the USSR fell apart, the Iron Curtain fell, and all these unfortunate, unprepared former Soviet citizens were submerged in all kinds of sexual content on TV and films, shows, commercials, magazines, ads, you name it. And because these former Soviet citizens were unaccustomed to that, they did not approach and assess such content with critical mind, unlike, again, most Western citizens by that time whose own sexual revolution happened a whole 30 years prior. As well, the collectivist values of working together towards the common goal were suddenly replaced with the encouragement of conspicuous consumption and goals related to the pursuit of pleasure. The romanticizing of illegal drugs came with this. In fact, many illegal drugs were openly advertised and even sold in stores. In other words, there was, all of a sudden, total freedom, and not always of the best kind. But that was just one part of the disaster. What we have to keep in mind is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of its economy, the banks, the currency, public services and institutions, and they were all public in the USSR, all collapsed with it. The overwhelming majority of people lost their income as well as all of their life savings. The money became worthless. Their jobs either disappeared because the establishments they had been working for all this time no longer existed, or these organizations, institutions, plants, and factories simply could not pay them salaries for many months at a time, so that people ended up with no money to even feed their families. The country was balancing on the brink of economic default and bankruptcy. The actual default did happen in 1998. Because of this, everyone who was of the working age, especially people who had children, had to work all kinds of odd jobs day and night to make their ends meet. However, that meant that all their children and teenagers were left to themselves with little parental supervision and no one to teach them right from wrong. And these children are exactly who we're talking about. They are the Russian women who are now in their late 20s, 30s, and early 40s. The morally lost generation of the 90s and early 2000s. These children and teenagers were left to their own devices in a new country which now had no censorship whatsoever, and one of the main ideas promoted in the media at the time, besides drugs and pleasure, was the glamorized image of escorts and mistresses of rich men. Being a prostitute, especially an elite one, was presented as glamorous and desirable, and as the surest way for a young woman to attain a comfortable or even a wealthy life quickly. And the disturbing thing is that there was truth to that in Russia in that time period. when almost everyone working normal jobs had lost them or was not getting paid at all and had barely enough money to buy basic groceries. Education was now worthless. Building a career was useless. There was no money in any professional occupations because of the breakdown of all institutions. The only way to make money for most people was to go into unregulated trade, as in buying luggagefuls of clothes and shoes in one place, then going onto the street and reselling these in another. In fact, most one-time professionals, scientists, engineers, academics, literally now had to do just that to survive. Then there was racketeering, meaning protecting or covering for such unregulated businesses in exchange for a share in profits. Then fighting with other gangs of raiders over territory, something that was also a commonplace occurrence in the 90s. Many boys and young men got involved in this and got injured and killed in these fights. And if you were a young woman, your hope for a comfortable or even wealthy existence was to become a girlfriend or a mistress of such criminal authority, a leader of a successful gang. Become a secretute, words secretary and prostitute combined, meaning to work as a secretary and a sexual property to a rich boss of some newly privatized company, or to be an escort, a street prostitute, or to sell yourself successfully abroad as a mail-order bride. Being a mistress or wife to a newly rich Russian businessman was seen as the ultimate success story every woman should aspire to. What's interesting is that if you look at most books and novels written by Russian authors in the 90s, they will likely feature as its main characters a rich guy who has a business and who is involved in some criminal mafia-type affairs, which was the only way to do business back then, and business was the only way to get rich, and he's mistress or mistresses for female characters. There is a carryover of this theme even to modern Russian movies. Most of them somehow still feature some kind of an oligarch, or a minigarch at least, from Moscow in their plot, and if a female main character is a positive one, she ends up being rewarded with marriage to such guy, or to his rich son if she's very young. Speaking about wives of oligarchs and minigarchs, there were agencies and famous individual middlemen who organized, among other things, so-called brides parades for such clients by pre-selecting the best-looking women and presenting them in a beauty pageant-type display to the rich customers, who could then choose themselves a girlfriend or companion among these young women. Also, the image of a prostitute, especially one working with foreign clients, was actively promoted and glamorized. The first symbol and inspiration of this time period and its values is the movie Intergirl, Interdevочка, that came out in 1989. I mean, really, this movie was the first of its kind to be shown in what was still technically for 2 more years the Soviet Union. The movie is about, well, a prostitute, or a nurse who became a prostitute as her second job, working in a hotel in Moscow with mostly international clients. One of these clients then proposes to her, and they move to Sweden, where he's from. Technically, this movie has a bad ending, but this ending isn't nearly discouraging and off-putting enough, more frustrating, really. And it ended up inspiring rather than discouraging most young girls and women. So, in the 90s, the sex workers flooded the streets, cafes, and restaurants. And girls as young as 14 years old and even younger were numerous among them. Young girls and women were often recruited by their own friends who would often come for a visit to their local town from Moscow, dressed in expensive clothes, would bring with them expensive gifts, and when asked how they made all this money, would offer their friends to try it out for themselves. A number of these young women were trafficked abroad. Many were tortured and killed by their clients. In the early 2000s, this phenomena stopped being as noticeable, partly because most of these sex workers moved from the streets into private apartments. With the popularity and widespread use of the internet around that time, all kinds of websites advertising mail-order brides appeared. Some of these women, mail-order brides, were pretty desperate, ready to put up with a lot for a chance at a better life in another country. But then, of course, there were also lots of scammers who would use fake photos or even pay beautiful women to pose as potential brides in order to appear more convincing, then ask men for money on all kinds of pretexts, such as for plane tickets or for treatment of a dying relative. And such dishonesty and cheating was not even seen as something bad or reprehensible. The brand new, chaotic, and lawless capitalist way of life dictated that survival and profit were priorities. In the absence of any support from the government, it was all about the survival of the fittest and the most resourceful. All kinds of cheating and deceiving like that was, and sometimes still is, unfortunately, often seen as almost praiseworthy, as a sign of being artful and clever on the part of the con artist, and whoever fell victim to them, on the other hand, is seen as deserving of their fate for being so naive and foolish. And like I said, this view is actually often true in Russia to this day. As I said earlier, it may not be as brutal and in your face as it used to be a couple of decades ago, but the pattern is still there. Actually, it's funny because when I looked online to see what American men were saying about their mail order brides from Eastern Europe, I saw that a number of them were complaining how the FSU women seemed to think of law abiding and of playing by the rules as foolish and pointless. In turn, in the FSU territory, foreigners from roughly any country west of Poland are often viewed as too naive and trusting, an easy prey almost. And I suspect that this attitude is even more pronounced in some other countries, especially those that are even farther removed from Europe. Maybe someone from one of these countries will at some point step forward and talk openly about their own local attitudes too. It would be an interesting subject, an interesting video to watch. But yes, you can see this attitude towards foreigners reflected in pretty much all Russian movies featuring a Western foreign character. They're portrayed as too gullible, naive, and trusting to the point of being foolish. In reality, of course, it is just that when one lives in a more safe and developed country, one does not have to constantly be on high alert and expect to be screwed over and taken advantage of or be verbally insulted on a daily basis, and so one can allow themselves to be generally relaxed and open most of the time. But in Russia and in other such countries, this kind of openness is often perceived as immaturity, and politeness as weakness and subservience. And this is actually one of the main differences between Russians or other Eastern Europeans and Americans. Russians in general always seem to be tense and serious, and they don't usually smile. There's actually a whole lecture about the culture of wariness, tension, and defensiveness in Russia. Unfortunately, the lecture is in Russian, but it would be an interesting idea to make an English video based on this lecture. On the other hand, to a foreign person, it may appear, for example, that many women from Russia and from other post-Soviet countries do not respect themselves enough because, for instance, many of them will not get offended even if a man approaches them with an overly sexual compliment or suggestion. But as far as many of these women are concerned, it is first still a validation, and on top of that, if by continuing to talk to such a man they then get him to do something that they want, then it is all well worth it, as far as they're concerned. While a typical Western woman would never think it is worth it to endure any disrespectful, inappropriate comments from a man just to have something done for her. By the way, for a while, in the early 2000s, there was this whole bitch or sterva trope that was very popular in Russia. The concept of sterva is really a mix of bitch with femme fatale, and many women aspired to be that, meaning to take advantage of men to weaponize their appearance and sexuality, to not allow any feelings towards a man, or anyone really, to care only about oneself, etc. There were many books written about it, and yes, I know, there was at least one relatively well-known book on how to be a bitch by an American author, but in Russia this idea was much bigger. Book series about it were in every store. Female coaches were training women to be that. Countless articles and online posts were written about it. I actually came across one such book on how to be a bitch at the Russian language section of the local library here in Canada even. But let's talk more about these and other specific differences in the worldview and attitudes of Eastern European versus American or Western women in the second part of the video. In this part, we've explored some recent history of the region, the former Soviet Union, in order to be able to better understand how all these unique views and attitudes likely originated. And again, please keep in mind that I'm talking about general tendencies and averages and not describing exactly what every single woman in this region is like. So I will see you in part 2 of this video soon. Thanks for watching.